The shooting death of Micaiah Bryant on Tuesday by a Columbus Division of Police officer raised questions about the use of deadly force. City Council President Shannon G. Hardin called for a change in police officers' training so that guns are not the final answer to every threat. James Scanlan, a retired Columbus Division of Police officer of 33 years, 19 of that on the SWAT team, trains officers throughout the United States. He's a subject matter expert on the use of deadly force.
The training dictates that when appropriate and when you have time and distance on your side, you might elect to use less lethal in many situations. This was not one of those cases, obviously. You saw the video as well as I did. And the fact is, as soon as the officer got out, one female came chasing another female and had a knife in her hand and got so close to her, I thought when she went down, she may have actually been stabbed when she went down. That person with the knife then redirected their aggression to a young lady that was up against a car, ran past the officer, got to that person, got wrapped up in that person, had the knife in hand, and was coming up with that knife when the officer finally fired. That's what we call a lethal situation. That person's life was in serious jeopardy. It was not the time to say, well, let's try mace or let's try a taser. No police officer is trained in that, to do that. They're trained to stop the threat in a life and death situation, whether the threat be against them or be against another person.
Scanlan gives evidence in court cases. He pointed out the legal standards are set by the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Supreme Court. Those laws say an officer is justified in using deadly force to save themselves or another person. And the test isn't the reasonable man in the street, it's the police officer's peers.
The legal standard for officers is set by the Constitution, which is then influenced by the U.S. Supreme Court and the cases in the U.S. Supreme Court. And those cases are named Graham versus Connor, Tennessee versus Garner, and there's other applicable cases. But in essence, what they say is an officer is justified in using deadly force. One of the reasons is to save themselves. Another reason is to save another person. And they say and that use of force has to be reasonable, not to everybody, but it has to be reasonable to another police officer who's been in those situations before. And what they recognize is these situations are so chaotic and they are so quickly evolving that we need, and the court decision said this, we need to try to prevent this armchair quarterbacking 20/20 hindsight theory when judging the actions of an officer, because we can't just take a timeout. And the courts understand that. You can't just take a timeout and say, okay, can we just time out here and see if maybe I can do this or I can do that or do whatever? Because by the time you do that, someone's dead.
But if an officer stands by and lets a situation play out, there isn't any real penalty for that.
The officer could have done nothing. And now that's true. And the officer, and I'm not sure who would have been upset by that today, except for the women who would have been stabbed and maybe killed and maybe their family. But the officer could have elected, because knowing what was going to come down, whether an officer has to fire to save their own life or to save another person's life, in today's environment, they know the heat is coming down on them from above, from our politicians and everyone else.
More officers are beginning to hesitate, and we are going to see a loss of life as a result, Scanlan believes. For the digital team, this is Cynthia Rossi on NBC4i.com.